$. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We spend the rest of the hour with the acclaimed Palestinian writer, Mohammed El-Kurd. His new book is out today, Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal. The book's publication comes at a time when even books about Palestinians are seen as a threat to the Israeli state. On Sunday, Israeli police raided 2 locations of the educational bookshop, a beloved Palestinian-owned store in occupied East Jerusalem. Israel detained the bookstore owners, Mahmoud and his nephew Ahmad Muna, who were held for 2 nights before being released earlier today. Ahmad spoke after his release.
We have just been released after 2 days of arrest. I have been released. Mahmoud we are waiting for his release. This arrest was brutal. The bases are not clear. We have been released today with conditions. We have to stay at home for 5 days of arrest, and we are not allowed in the shops for 20 days. It was a brutal, hard arrest, and it's obvious that there are no charges so far, so there's nothing that we're held for.
Witnesses said the Israeli police used Google Translate during the raid to determine the names of books in Arabic. He said, quote, anything they didn't like, they took. There are reports books seized included children's coloring book titled From the River to the Sea, and Noam Chomsky's book Gaza in Crisis, which he co-wrote with the Israeli scholar Ilan Pappé. Our guest, Mohammed El-Kurd, grew up in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, where Israel spent years trying to evict Palestinian families in order to give their homes to Jewish settlers. Mohammed El-Kurd, welcome back to Democracy Now! Congratulations on your new book. As you go around the country presenting Perfect Victims, you hear about this bookstore being closed and the owners being arrested. Your thoughts and the significance of going after the books?
I mean, I think this is the attack on the educational bookstore in Jerusalem is yet another saga in the Israeli regime's scholasticide, the attack on culture, scholars. You know, we've seen them literally bomb every single university in the Gaza Strip. And the educational bookstore is, in fact, not the first bookstore in Jerusalem to be closed down, its owners arrested. So there is, you know, a criminalization of thought, a criminalization of the intellect, really. And we've seen this extend even to the realms of social media, where so many thousands of the people who have been arrested in the past 15 months have been arrested over Facebook posts. So the Israeli regime really is waging a war of consciousness against the Palestinians' ability to express national sentiments. And we see this also here in the United States with President Trump saying things like students who support the resistance will have their visas revoked. So there's an attack on, you know, the intellect itself.
And Mohammed El-Kurd, you asked why Palestinians have to preface their support for the struggle against the occupation with some kind of statement distancing themselves from resistance actions like the attacks of October 7th of 2023. Why is this problematic? While supporters of Israel are never expected to decry the everyday violence of the occupation?
Because it's racist, because there's an impossible standard, there's an impossible demand made of the Palestinians to be, you know, for lack of a better expression, perfect victims, to portray themselves in this, with this ethnocentric civility that adheres to Western guidelines. Otherwise, they would be deserving of death, they would be deserving of being bombed. And to reject this is to say that the Declaration of Human Rights is unconditional, and it's universal. And to reject this is to say that, you know, we believe in dignity. We don't believe in having to shrink ourselves or to perform a different script in order to be awarded freedom and dignity. These are things we are entitled to.
And I wanted to ask you about the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This became a flashpoint. It's still a flashpoint in the United States for attacking pro-Palestinian groups for being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. Yet many in the Israeli government, in the current Israeli government, actually support from the river to the sea as an Israeli state, and no one raises a fuss about it.
Yeah, of course, because the issue is not the statement itself. The issue is who says it. The Israelis could say from the river to the sea and more. They could say all kinds of explicitly genocidal statements, and yet with us, they have to read between the lines. They have to infer and look for the hidden insidiousness in such chants. But it's comical, in my opinion, that we are being often interrogated about our chants, about what we say on social media. Meanwhile, when we talk about them, we're talking about bombs and airstrikes and burning people alive in their tents in hospital beds.
Mohammed, before we talk about your title, Perfect Victims, I just want to ask about your background, because we repeatedly interviewed you here and when you were in Sheikh Jarrah. And for people to understand that neighborhood and what happened there, and the people involved being the leaders of Israel today, talk about the occupation of Sheikh Jarrah and what happened in your own home.
Yeah, I mean, the story of our home is as unique and absurd as it is common. This is a neighborhood where tax-exempt charities registered in the United States, settler organizations, Jewish American organizations will come and claim our homes by divine decree, and they will exploit an already asymmetrical judiciary that is built by settlers for settlers to say your homes are ours and we have the right to kick you out of them. And so I, like many Palestinians, grew up with quite literally an American settler in my house. And it's
wait a second. Now you're 25 right now.
26. Yeah.
26.
Yeah.
When was your home? Were you forced to share it with someone who wasn't in your family?
It was about 2009. 2009, I came home from school, and half of our house was gone. There was a settler inside it, a settler from Long Island. And, you know, right across the street from us, our neighbors, the Ghawi family and the Hannoun family, had lost the entirety of their home to settler organizations. And, you know, across the years, these settler organizations have gotten more and more funding. And like you said, their accomplices and people who work for them and people who lead these organizations have found their way increasingly to the government. But this is indicative of a larger.
They set up offices in Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah, they set up offices in Sheikh Jarrah. They kind of use our homes as the home basis to build their electability, their popularity, because the Israeli public is really eager to see this kind of desperation, to see this kind of brutality, and it invokes a sense of safety in the Israeli public to see their politicians literally in the backyards of Palestinians saying, "We will take these homes, we will Jewdize them, we will colonize them."
And your home today?
Well, my home today, like 8 others, we have managed through a massive global solidarity campaign to postpone the expulsion orders, but we still hang in the balance. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few years.
How does that fit into your title, Perfect Victims?
Well, I mean, to do a global campaign and to demand solidarity for our neighborhood, you know, we were told and we were taught to perform this role of to read the script of the perfect victim. So to tell you more, you know, I grew up as a child, as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old. We would have journalists, diplomats, all kinds of people visit our neighborhood as though it's some kind of zoo. And I remember constantly I would talk to them, I would show them, you know, photos of the brutality that the settlers did against us, and I would be pulled to the side by, you know, other concerned diplomats or journalists, and they would tell me, you shouldn't use this phrase, you should use that phrase. And it got into a point that even as a child, I would correct my grandmother when she would refer to the Jewish American settlers in our home as Jewish. I would say, no, don't mention that. But this kind of obfuscation, this kind of omission was kind of drilled into us. And then you grow up and you have internalized this entire framework of editorializing yourself, of curating yourself in a way that is non-offensive to the Western gaze. And then you begin to curate and editorialize all the people around you. You look at people who have suffered pager attacks in South Lebanon, people who have had their homes demolished in the Gaza Strip, and you think, what is the way I can make this victim, this young victim, non-offensive or compelling to a Western racist audience? When you at some point you have to liberate yourself from these shackles and say, actually, this is the victim. This is the oppressed, not the oppressor, not the perpetrator. And we should shift our focus and scrutinize the perpetrators, the oppressors, the colonizers, the focal point and the root cause of all of the violence in Palestine, which is ultimately Zionism.
Mohammed, I want to ask you how Donald Trump's recent comments on Gaza tie into what's at the heart of your book. He's described Gaza as, quote, a big real estate site, and basically said that he doesn't believe Palestinians should be able to return once they've been removed.
I mean, ultimately, this so-called conflict has always been about the land, and any obfuscation of that fact is simply dishonest. Zionist greed has always been about Palestinian land. American interest in Palestine has been about keeping up a certain status quo, a military status quo in the Middle East, but it's also been about exploiting natural resources. I mean, Gaza is rich in natural gases, but what I think Donald Trump is doing is that he is dropping the script of the State Department, the official American script, and just saying things as they are without a filter. And that is helping people understand the long-term American project, because as disgusting and as abhorrent as Trump's comments were about creating property on the Gaza Strip, it would have never been possible had it been not for the Democratic Party and President Biden flattening Gaza and allowing the flattening of Gaza in the first place.
Can you talk about Shireen Abu Akleh as you talk about her in Perfect Victims, the renowned Al Jazeera journalist who was shot dead by an Israeli sniper, though she was wearing the helmet and the flak jacket. She was outside of the Jenin refugee camp. And how you feel she has been described?
I mean, I want to quote Palestinian scholar Aruba Uthman. She uses this phrase that Shireen Abu Akleh was killed twice. One, first time by the Israelis, and the second time when we all started to refer to her as an American. You know, and we did this for a good cause. We had the best interest, the best intentions. We think that Americans will be exonerated, will be compelling in ways that Palestinians aren't, right? It's every day that a Palestinian journalist gets killed, but it's not every day that an American journalist gets killed. But when we refer to Shireen Abu Akleh as an American, we are not increasing her chances of justice, but in fact we are divorcing her from the remainder of her people. We are exceptionalizing her from the very people that she was part and parcel of. And Shireen Abu Akleh was never a bystander. She was never silent. She was always on the side of justice. In 2002, during the Jenin massacre, she was digging with her bare hands in the rubble, helping mothers look for their children. This is not, you know, and this kind of paradigm that separates the journalists from the rest of their people is really like an outdated paradigm, I think, and it does a lot. It does a lot more harm than good. It doesn't humanize people. It actually exceptionalizes them. It transcends them into this kind of infallible status that nobody else and their peers can assent to.
And I wanted to ask you, while so much attention has been focused on the Israeli wars in Gaza and in Lebanon, talk about what the situation is right now in the West Bank for Palestinians, and has it ever been at this crisis level in the past?
No, I mean it's horrifying what's happening in the occupied West Bank, and it's like you said, it has never, it has never been at this level of brutality. UNRWA reports that there's been 40,000 Palestinians displaced. We are seeing the Jenin refugee camp and other places in the West Bank bombed every single day. There are more and more martyrs, and we've heard, you know, many months ago that the Israelis, you know, gave the settlers 200,000 rifles, and you see these rifles while you're walking around the West Bank.
We're going to have to leave it there now, but we're going to do part 2 right afterwards and post it at democracynow.org. I want to ask you about the poet, beloved academic activist Rafat El-Hariri, who has finally been laid to rest more than a year after he was killed in an Israeli airstrike, along with his brother, his sister, and his 4 nephews. His family recovered their remains after a neighbor buried them in a yard at the site of the Israeli attack. Rafat was buried in a cemetery in Gaza City, Shujaiya neighborhood, where Rafat was born. He appeared on Democracy Now! Several times.
Hope we have is in the growing popular support in America, in the movements the movements, the human rights and the rights movements in America and across Europe to take to the streets to pressure their politicians into putting an end to this dark episode of not only the history of the Middle East, but also the history of humanity. If people are asking how was the Holocaust allowed and other genocides in Africa and across the world, now you can see this live on TV, live on social media. Palestinians, whole blocks destroyed, hospitals, schools, businesses. We are speaking about thousands and thousands of housing units destroyed by Israel. So my message to the free people of the world is to move, to pressure, to mobilize, and to take to the streets.
Those were the words of Rafat al-Hariri on Democracy Now! October 10th, 2023. He was killed 2 months later. After his death, the actor Brian Cox recited Rafat al-Hariri's poem, If I Must Die.
If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale.
Brian Cox reciting Rafat al-Hariri's poem, If I Must Die. I remember it well. We were in Dubai at the UN Climate Summit when we learned. Talk about, Mohammed, where you were. You begin your book with dedication. I want to ask you about who Omar is, but also in loving memory of Dr. Rafat al-Hariri. Where were you the day you learned he died?
I was in my apartment in New York, and I was en route to go to the airport to go to London, and it was quite the shock to hear that.
You had been communicating with him in the weeks before?
Yeah, we've been in constant communication, and there are just people who you can only think about in the present tense, and it's hard to think that they would pass, and he was one of them. I don't want to talk about him as though he was infallible, but he really did not mince words. It was just he was not my personal teacher, but he always felt like a teacher. Just watching how he utilized humor, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, of his students that speak for him.
He had already his home was bombed when you were texting with him.
Yeah.
So he had just left his home?
Yeah, he did, and he sent me, it's almost hard to talk about, but he sent me a message, a very, very sweet message, saying that the only 2 things that he took from his home was a copy of his anthology, Gaza Writes Back, and a copy of my poetry book, and it was it was a very profound message to receive from such a giant. It meant a lot to me.
So he was talking about your book, Rifka, which you began as a teenager, a collection of poetry named for your grandmother. Before we continue talking about Perfect Victims, talk about your grandmother.
I like, I like to say that my grandmother was an icon of resilience, in the sense that she lived through the British Mandate, she lived through the Israeli, occupation of 48 lands, and then 67 lands, and then she lived through First Intifada, Second Intifada, and then our house being taken once and twice, and being threatened with expulsion in Sheikh Jarrah. And she was very, very, very. She was a very stubborn woman. People like to say defiant. And I think that's also true about her. But she was also very, very stubborn, and she loved to call things by their names. And she was just emblematic of Palestinian women at large. They're largely erased. We often talk about women and children being the people who bear the brunt of war, which is true. But oftentimes in that framing, we kind of erase the contributions that women have contributed to the anti-colonial struggle. Palestinian women have played vital roles in the First Intifada and the Second Intifada, in the Unity uprising in 2021, and today, and they're often disregarded.
Well, you talk a lot in Perfect Victims, and that's implied in the title itself, about the framing and who gets to frame your life, your community's life, the life of Palestinians. Can you talk more about that? Who is the perfect victim and who isn't? You begin with, and you had little postcards at your opening event last night at the Judson Church, even if.
Yeah, ultimately, even if is the thesis of the book. It's to say, the demand of us is to be perfect victims, and by that it means you have to kind of adhere to a certain civility, to have proximity to whiteness, to quote unquote innocence, to non-alignment, to being non-partisan, to all of these kind of mythical adjectives that are demanded of you in the war zone. And so people will say the Israeli military killed this 15-year-old boy. And then the Israelis will say, well, he was throwing a Molotov cocktail. And I think we should say, even if he was throwing a Molotov cocktail, they shouldn't have killed him in the first place, because the Israeli occupation has no right to be there in the first place. Even if this person who was killed held bad views, or whatever you want to define bad views as, he shouldn't be killed in the first place, right? You want to tackle things at the root. You want to start at the very genesis of the issue, which is Israeli colonialism. All of these other things are irrelevant. My character, my disposition, my affect, these are irrelevant. But we live in a world where the oppressed are put on trial for their perceived biases and their perceived bigotries. Meanwhile, the perpetrators can get away with it and can continue to enact systemic violence against us and get away with it.
You talk a lot about dehumanization and how it happens. Talk about that and how you feel is the most powerful way to be humanized, to humanize your own population, people.
Well, there's, the dehumanization that says you are hordes and you are insects and you are vermin, that's very explicit. But there's also the very sinister, implicit dehumanization. In the book, I say it's the refusal to look us in the eye. But it's kind of the refusal to acknowledge that we, like others, have the rights and the needs to defend ourselves, to resist, to anger, to hatred, to disdain, to all the sentiments, right? When people say we are humanizing Palestinians, they're not really humanizing Palestinians. They're saying we're going to give this Palestinian a very restrictive script to fit in. And the true way to be human is to cover that full spectrum of humanity, that full scope of humanity that includes all of the human sentiments. And again, it is rooted in a very, very fallacious logic, the idea that the oppressed must live a life in cross-examination.
Can you talk, as you do in your book and your conversations, about the difference in the characterization of resistance? You compare how the Western media covers Ukraine resisting the occupation to those who resist the Israeli occupation and the different approach.
Yeah, I mean, the double standard is really flagrant, and I think we also should move past the double standard, but I think it's worth mentioning. I think the most absurd of these examples was I saw in the New York Post a headline that called a Ukrainian suicide bomber heroic. And I thought I was hallucinating because, I thought all my life suicide bombing was bad. And, Sky News, I think it was, held what essentially could be described as a Molotov making cocktail. And then you open the pages of the New York Times, they're interviewing Ukrainian psychologists who describe hatred of all Russians as, a formative energy, paraphrasing here. And you open other pages of the New York Times and they're kind of glorifying and romanticizing Ukrainian police and Ukrainian military wearing civilian clothes, quote, blending in to the population, things that they would accuse Palestinians of hiding behind human shields for. So this kind of double standard says to you that there's not really a misunderstanding of resistance in the Western mind. There is just a rejection of resistance when it comes from the indigenous population or from the population that threatens the status quo of the empire as it stands today.
You talk about Palestinians being defanged. What do you mean?
Defanged as in like non-threatening, non-offensive. In order for you to be allowed the microphone, or in order for you to be allowed into mainstream spaces, you have to make certain concessions. You are demanded to make certain concessions. To say that you're not you're non-violent and you don't hate your oppressors and you want peace and you want coexistence, and you're making all of these disclaimers before you even get to your talking point. And I know this from experience as a child, seeing diplomats coming into our living room. I would do this proclamation of, I don't hate Jews and I don't want to throw anyone into the sea, and all of these tropes that you've heard about me are true. And then 15 minutes pass, and then I finally say, and there are settlers in my house. But that...
And explain, for people who didn't see part one of this conversation, Sheikh Jarrah, and what you mean by there are settlers in your house.
Well, I mean, in the literal sense, in 1972, there were many settler organizations that claimed our houses as theirs by a divine decree. And they started to try to kick us out of our homes using an asymmetrical Israeli judiciary. And obviously the situation in Sheikh Jarrah is not unique. It's happening all across Palestine, all across historic Palestine, in many, many communities. It's just so that our neighborhood was one of the few neighborhoods lucky enough to get media scrutiny.
You arrested at that time?
I was arrested and detained multiple times, yeah.
What made you decide to leave? And do you consider yourself having left or just visiting the U.S. and Britain?
Well, I was already gone. I was already at CUNY when the Sheikh Jarrah stuff started to happen. I was already at CUNY doing my master's. And I just decided to come back for the campaign to be with my family and friends. And, I've lived, ever since I've come here, I've lived, half of the year here, half of the year there. But since October 7th and since the kind of uptick in crackdown, or the unprecedented level of crackdown on dissent, on activism, on anti-colonial sentiment, it's been a bit hard. I've been advised, not to return just for safety reasons. I mean, I give the dedication to my dear, 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 dear friend, Omar, who I really hope he's doing okay. He is one of the many, many Palestinians who have been held for many months on end without charge or trial on what Israelis call administrative detention. And the Palestinian prisoners right now, the political prisoners right now, are suffering abhorrent conditions. We are not hearing much about it, but so many of them have skin conditions like scabies. So many of them have been starved, tortured. We heard about sexual abuse in prison, rapes. We've seen horrific videos, and the Israelis have always been incredibly abusive towards Palestinian political prisoners. But in the past 15 months, it has gotten to unprecedented levels of brutality.
And can you talk as a writer about the writing of your book, Perfect Victims, where you were you've written this over the last years as the Israeli assault on Gaza has unfolded, the tens of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. President Trump himself calls it a demolition site, which is unlivable. Of course, his solution is, he talks about it as a great real estate deal. It can be the Riviera of the Middle East, and Palestinians cannot be a part of that, he says. This is his latest in his last few days, saying they should not have a right of return.
I mean, to write a book in the shadow of genocide is quite, I would say, difficult task, but I think it's also like an arrogant task, particularly if you're trying to write conclusions about this genocide, and I don't think I tried to do that much in the book. I was trying to really tackle advocacy and media framing and how we talk to each other and how our allies and so-called allies talk to us and what they demand of us. And but it was, you're constantly, first of all, confronted with the enormity of the moment that we were living in, to see people being quite literally burnt alive, or people hanging from ceiling fans, people being mutilated by the Israeli military, and you are confronted with the question of the insufficiency of words and of the written language, and what even is the point, right? And there comes a point where you have to reject this kind of nihilism or this kind of pessimism and decide for yourself that to be, it's the least that you can do is to try to raise the ceiling. I say to raise the ceiling of what is permissible in the beginning of the book, but really, like, to see so many students being policed and to see so many people being bombed, and you see your platform and you see that you're a person who people who listen to, and you think to yourself, what is it that I can do to really raise the ceiling, to make it easier for others to say what they need to say. And obviously this book has been, it has my name on the cover, but it's a million people who've worked on it, from my editors and my publishers, but also just my mentors and friends and people in Palestine who've really shaped my analysis throughout the years.
You talk about warning about over-victimization. I mean, in fact, you can't say enough about the horror that has taken place. And yet talk about the dangers of over-victimization and what that means when it comes to people having agency.
Yani, when we editorialize a victim past, somebody has suffered a certain atrocity, and we try to editorialize that even further, we are kind of implying that atrocity they have suffered is not enough, and that they have needed to suffer something further for them to be compelling. And I'll even implicate myself in this. I was writing about a Palestinian-American man named Omar Asad, kind of critiquing the employment of citizenship in our advocacy tactics and saying how short-sighted it is. And this is a man, a Palestinian martyr, who has been bound, gagged by the Israeli military and left to die in the cold. And I remember when I was writing about him, I spent a substantial amount of time looking for an article that confirmed that he had also been beaten, because something within me told me it wasn't enough that he had been blindfolded and left to die. I needed him somehow to be beaten as well. You ask yourself, what is it that has drilled these tendencies into me? And it's dangerous, because it means that they can always move the goalposts. It means that their brutality can never be enough, that there is something that can always go further. But I say, even if the brutality they enact against us is merely bureaucratic, even if they were polite in the way that they kill us, that still is unacceptable. That is still deplorable. Even if, they merely blindfolded him and saved him right before he was dead, that still is deplorable. We do not need to over-victimize. And also there's the opposite end of that, which is the, treating people as though they are heroes, or as though they are just, incapable of feeling pain, or just able to withstand any circumstances. And that, too, is a form of dehumanization. We must understand that people are complex and have, it's quite a basic it's quite a basic thesis that I'm saying here, but you challenge the reader, you challenge the listener to really challenge and interrogate their biases, and they will agree with you in theory, but oftentimes they will either want to strip somebody of their agency completely by saying they turned the other cheek all the time and they would never hurt a fly and they loved their oppressors even as they killed them, or by saying that they are infallible heroes that couldn't care less about the brutality being waged against them.
I want to end this conversation where you begin the book, and I was wondering if you can read from the sniper's hands are clean of blood, and start with the quote and where the quote is from.
This is Patrick Fiackuch's, I hope I said the name right, he's an Irish poet who my friend Roisin introduced me to, and his quote goes, it's from a poem, and the quote goes, "And the men are men, and the women are men, and the children are men." And I'll read from the book. "We die a lot. We die in fleeting headlines in between breaths. Our death is so quotidian that journalists report it as though they're reporting the weather. Cloudy skies, light showers, and 3,000 Palestinians dead in the past 10 days. And much like the weather, only God is responsible. Not armed settlers, not targeted drone strikes. We pay no heed to the corpses in our fields. Their existence is monotonous, predictable. The slaughter is so relentless, it is almost expected, anticipated by the soon-to-be slain. Their wrists, big and tiny, bound with zip ties in the back of police cars. Death is everywhere. Even metaphor is a casualty of war. The figurative has become painfully literal. Bloodied beards, furniture and trees, a limb hanging from a ceiling fan, women giving birth on the concrete, etc. Are we too acquainted with the horrific? What was once horrifying, what once a harbinger of doom, now blends into the terrain. Death is now as a boring scarecrow. Even when the ravens glow louder, their croaking falls on disinterested ears. No sanctity left in this death. No deities come to the rescue. We die forsaken. We die a lot in abandonment. Our massacres are only interrupted by commercial breaks. Judges legalize them. Correspondents kill us with passive voice. If we are lucky, diplomats say that our death concerns them, but they never mention the culprit, let alone condemn the culprit. Politicians, inert, inept, or complicit, fund our demise, then feign sympathy, if any. Academics stand idle, that is, until the dust settles. Then they will write books about what should have been, coin terms and such, lecture us in the past tense, and the vultures, even in our midst, will tour museums glorifying, romanticizing what they once condemned, what they did not deign to defend, our resistance, mystifying it, depoliticizing it, commercializing it. The vultures will make sculptures out of our flesh, and we die.
Mohammed El-Kurd, Palestinian journalist, poet, author. His new book is out today. It's called Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal. To see our part one of the interview, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.